Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Anjum Hasan and Professor Arupjyoti Saikia. Anjum is a novelist, short story writer, poet, and a books editor. Born in Shillong, Meghalaya, she currently lives in Bangalore and I just discovered in my neck of the woods in northern Bangalore. Her works include a poetry collection, Street on the Hill, which was awarded the Sahitya Academy Award in 2006, and her latest novel is History's Angel. Amongst her other publications include the books The Cosmopolitans, Neeti, Not This, Lunatic in My Head, and Difficult Pleasures. Anjum has been a Homi Bhabha Fellow, a Charles Wallace Writer-in-Residence, and is currently a New India Foundation Fellow. Her writing has been variously described, including as haunting and lyrical, acquiring a lyrical intensity, and about one of the novels, it's been said it's a novel of ideas and emotions that questions the place of art in modern life. Arup teaches history at the Indian Institute of Technology, Guwahati. He's also an Agrarian Studies Fellow of Yale University. He's the author of the following books: The Quest for Modern Assam, A History 1942 to 2000, which is the subject of today's program; Forests, An Ecological History of Assam, 1986 to 2000; A Century of Protests, Peasant Politics in Assam since 1900; and The Unquiet River, An Environmental History of the Brahmaputra. The Unquiet River was shortlisted for the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay Book Award in 2020, longlisted for the Attagalata Bangalore Literature Festival Book Prize in 2020, and got honorable mention for the Ananda Kentish Kumaraswamy Book Prize in 2021, given by the Association of Asian Studies based in the USA. Presently, Arup is writing an economic history of Assam for the period 1947 to 2000, and this is scheduled to be published by the Cambridge University Press. Please put your hands together to welcome Anjum and Arup.
Thank you so much, Ravi, for that extended and warm introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Arup, welcome to Bangalore. I've been personally excited about this book that we're discussing today since it appeared, in fact, in 2023. And part of the reason is that I come from the Northeast. I grew up there. I'm doing some research on Shillong, on Meghalaya, and you can't do that without looking at the history of Assam, because Assam was more or less entirely what once was almost entirely what the Northeast is today. Apart from the princely states of Tripura, Manipur, and Sikkim, what we call Assam in the late colonial period, post-colonial period, was virtually the rest of the Northeast. And the story of how it became present-day Assam from that much more extensive territory, but also a much more multicultural place in some ways, that is one of the many stories you tell in your book, because it extends from 1940 to the present. But that's not the only story, and I just heard Ravi say that you're writing an economic history of Assam, and that would be very interesting because you do tell the story of Assam's journey from being once a very prosperous state to, at the moment, you end in the year 2000, and it's described as still relatively poor in relation to other Indian states. So I wanted to start with that, in fact. And as I was thinking of the book, I mean, you can see the size of it. It's a very, very... I'm searching for a word.
I'm so sorry.
It's certainly comprehensive, but it also packs a punch, literally. And so the economic history is only, like I said, it's only one strand. The other strand is present-day Assam versus modern Assam, which is an entity you already had by the middle of the 20th century. So there are all these strands, but as I was thinking about how do I organize this discussion, We can't obviously cover everything. I started thinking of 3 themes broadly, and interestingly, they all start with C. The first one was Cinderella. You know, the metaphor of a Cinderella. And that's very interesting because Assam, like I said, was very rich in resources, has been, still is. And one criticism of people both leading popular protests in Assam in the 20th century, as well as elected legislators, has been that Assam's riches have been extracted and made other people rich, whether in mainland India, whether it's capitalists elsewhere, whether it's the colonial setup. The riches have not gone back to the people. And these were mostly tea, jute, and oil. And all through your book, we keep coming back to this issue of how do you keep the resources for your own people, right? And one of the former chief ministers of Assam in the pre-colonial period, Muhammad Sadullah, he uses this phrase Cinderella. Like Assam will become even more of a Cinderella if Sylhet is taken away from her. And that word really struck me because Assam is called Cinderella even in the colonial period. You know, if you read the memoirs of some of the colonials, for instance, Henry Cotton, who was a chief commissioner of Assam, late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. He also says that Assam is a Cinderella, its people are so poor, its peasants are so wretched, and there's a visit of Lord Curzon. And he appeals to Lord Curzon saying, do something for Assam, and Curzon says, it's the weather, you can't do anything, Assam is destined to be a Cinderella. So this idea of a Cinderella as this sort of a mistreated, exploited figure. What would you feel about that? Because there is this very strong sense of Assam, you know, having this, and I'll come to why Cinderella is such a potent image also in relation to India, because, you know, if you have a stepdaughter who's mistreated, then you have to have the evil stepmother, the cruel stepmother who's doing the mistreating. But, I mean, how do you see this theme of Assam's exploitation and its mistreatment, economically especially?
You know, I have been teaching a course called Colonial Economic History of India to a bunch of students who are basically from different kind of training, right? Many of them are engineers, some are biologists, some are physicists, right? And they are my students for the last 15 plus years, right? And this is the questions that I have been asking them, that whether they have heard anything about the word called colonialism or not, right? And believe me, that most of these students, they are vaguely aware of this story. They know that India got independence. But what does colonialism mean for an average Indians? It is beyond the comprehension of these students, right? And I think Shashi Tharoor was aptly right when he went to England to give that talk, which caught the attention of an average Indians and average Britishers. It's not that history was not told by historians earlier, right? But I think the language and the moment, I think it was important. If I reduce that story, I think it is the classic story of the colonialisms, how it got stage in one part of South Asia, right? How it got manifested, right? Right from the late 18th century till to a major part of the 20th century, right? Colonialism has many ways of its staging, its avatars are changing in different parts of the country. But Assam or northeastern India, right, the manifestations took many forms, and I think that impact, right, it shaped the history of many kind of resentment, many kind of unhappiness, many kind of or say a deep-rooted impoverishment of these regions, right, for a long period of time. You know, normally Assam's story is always being seen as a story of tea or oil, right? These are the two classic examples who is an average South Asian reader would be familiar with, right? But I think that was not the issue. So as I'm writing the new book, Economic History of Assam after 1947, I really have to think about the legacy, right? What Assam had inherited in 1947. In fact, you know, this was one of the most important debate in the Constituent Assembly. What would be the nature of the union government and the state's engagement with the question of economy of India, right? Normally, when we talk about India's constitution, we largely talk about the questions of rights, fundamental rights, directives, elections, right? These are the issues that we talked about. But the constitution makers, they spent quite a substantive number of days on the questions of this income of the states and the kind of situations that India and its provinces had inherited in the 1940s, right? So to take that back story to Assam's case, Cinderella's symptoms, right? You know, let me give you some tiny examples, but it has big implications for the story of impoverishment of these regions, but also which benefited a section or a tiny sections of the global entrepreneurs at that time. The classic example, I'm sure, I do not know whether you are familiar with that, is the story of Ficus elastica. Have you heard of this Ficus elastica? Right? Yes, rubber tree, right? The living tree. Yeah. Yes. That Ficus elastica is a kind of tree which was largely grown. There are many variety species of it, right? But one variety which produced this resin, it was largely produced, used to grow in the wild in the eastern Himalayas and also in the Patkais. When in 1860s, this resin was suddenly recognized in the Western world that this is the resin from where you will be making the rubber, right? Because suddenly in 1860, the automobile industries began to spring like anything, right? So where from you are getting this gum, right? Which will finally make the rubber, right? So Assam was one of the reasons, right? Along with other parts of the world, right? But in South Asia, it was one of the major parts. This particular resin, it will move, it will be collected by the petty collectors. These were basically residents of the highlands, say modern day Arunachal Pradesh, Nagaland, Mizoram, even the Western Burma, right? From the first belt, these were collected from these trees, right? This gum was collected, and this will come from those highlands. It will come and meet in the Brahmaputra. It will go to Calcutta, and from there, they will make their onward journey to the European industries, especially France, Germany, and Britain. These were their final destinations. But the benefit, you know, by 1880s, 1890s, most of those trees were cut down. They were damaged heavily. This is what the outcome of development, right? And this was what was happening in 1880s, right? Many British official anthropologists who were traveling through the dense mountain areas into the Burma and other regions, they would found that most of these trees were damaged, they were destroyed because in source of the gum, right? The resins have to be collected. And these were all wildly growing. However, you know, the beneficiary of this entire trade were primarily two sections of the people, right? A tiny group of Indian businessmen, whom we call the Marwaris, right? They were a bunch of people from largely northwestern part of India, right, from belonging to different castes, but essentially they were a very enterprising class of businessmen, as you all know. Many of them had arrived in Assam by the late 18th century, essentially a salt trader, right, to sell salt into that regions, but also provider of credit, money, and other kind of commodities to the future British officials, military people. So these were these people who got involved in this trade, in this collection of rubber, the gum, and the subsequent profit. But this involved violence, raid, a lot of atrocities, and also a lot of, deceiving. You have to deceive the people, right? And also the British traders, right? In this entire project, probably my sense is the entire populations really probably did not make a single pie in terms of profit. I do not have an exact calculations, right? There may be some tertiary benefit out of it, but in sum total, the benefit was really, really nominal, right?
What about the land on which these trees stood? Who owned that land?
These were largely the government, the community-owned land, right? Obviously, over a period of. In fact, these were the lands where the East India Company and later on the British government also, they had really loose control. They were not formally, but they were still under the control of the communities, right? Loose kind of control, right? So the the Ficus elastica was one such example, right? There would be all kind of trees, plants, insects, and everybody contributed. Let me again emphasize this point. Even insects, they also contributed to the making of this economy. Lac was another example, right? Japan was one of the important importer of lac from the northeastern India, even in the 19th century. By the late 19th century, early 20th century, all the gramophones and everything was expanding, and it needed the huge supply of lac from this eastern Himalaya, right? And this interplay of insects, plants, and the humans together, they all contributed to the making of this new imperial economy, right? The local people really did not benefit out of that, right? Then, obviously, there were minerals, there were timbers, there were elephants, there were rhinos, there were all such kind of things. Humans and non-humans all collectively contributed in forms of labor, in forms of commodity, in forms of everything. It was a classic example of colonizations, right? Similar things, colonialism obviously developed, took shape in other parts of India in different ways. But the capabilities of the local people, the economic capabilities, political capabilities, even cultural capabilities were far ahead, or they were at many times. They can rework themselves, they can really negotiate themselves, right? With the East India Company and later on with the colonial government, right? In these matters, I think the social organizations, political organizations, and even the economic potentiality, right? The native wealth, right? It was far behind, right? They could not really negotiate. That's why you'll see that the classic example of the rise of military raids into the hills, so many things happen, right? And all this collectively produced a history of exploitations, right? Classic example, which really do not fit into other parts of India. That's why, Shashi Tharoor's example, right, is a classic. It fits so well into that, and that's why, the sense of resentment, we could not do anything. That's why and this model, right, also got replicated even 1950s, 60s to some extent, and it took many forms and manifestations, right?
I don't know enough about the rest of India, but I think, for instance, the Western Ghats,
Right.
the way in the colonial period that landscape and that ecology changed was also the result of these kind of interventions of the sort that you're describing took place in the Northeast. So I think wherever they found resources that they could use, but are you suggesting that the Northeast was particularly exploited.
No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying, the ability of the local societies to be part of these new formations and the new economy, right, was truly limited, right? Limited. In the Madras presidency, for example, right, because of a long history of trade, commerce, their participation in the Indian Ocean trade and everywhere, right? They had the skills, they had competence, they had wealth, and also the political structures to negotiate with these newcomers, so European trade and commerce, right? Exploitation did not stop, but the benefit also, they could to some extent, moderately, compared to what was happening there. That's why I'm saying that probably the instances of exploitation was more violent, probably in some places, but there can be other similar examples, right? Right.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely true, I think, because I'm researching the history of the Khasi Hills, which is sort of became, in the colonial imagination, became part of Assam. And these are the southern parts of the Khasi Hills just above the Bangladesh plains. And the first encroachment of the East India Company there was precisely because of the mineral resources, the limestone. If there wasn't limestone, they wouldn't really have bothered with that neck of the woods. I don't know so much about the elephants, but the limestone became increasingly valuable because one East India Company official is poking around there, and he's written a very riveting memoir, Lindsay, right. And he's climbing up these escarpments up from the plains of Bangladesh, and he sees these limestone cliffs. And he's completely gobsmacked because he realizes that this is better quality limestone than anything in the rest of the country, or even what he's seen back home in England. And that's sort of a trigger to start this mining of the limestone, and it's used in a very limited way locally. There isn't an industrial scale limestone operation at all. But what happens is that they have to do traffic with the local chieftains because they own, they have the rights to what goes on in those territories. So it's not straightforward. And there is research that shows that a sort of a middleman class developed, a local middleman class that sort of was negotiating between these chieftains and the British. I don't know if that really percolated down to the people who were actually working on the limestone, whether it really was a factor in creating a middle class, but some wealth was created locally, maybe only among a handful of elites. But it certainly changed everything. I mean, suddenly there was this whole limestone economy coming down to the plains of Bangladesh, and that whole riverine economy going down to Calcutta. And in fact, a lot of Fort William and all the new buildings that will be made in colonial Calcutta were made with Khasi limestone. So like I'm saying, the story of I mean, in this book, you focus more or less on tea and oil. I think you also talk about jute, but it'll be very fascinating to read your next book because I'm very curious about what actually happened in these other fields.
My story about the tea in this book, it is not about the colonial story of the tea. It is essentially what happened after 1947. Because we are so engrossed with the colonial tea planters, right? Who are these new planters after 1947? They are not British anymore, right? In fact, most of the British tea planters, they began to liquidate their estates, their wealth and resources by 1940s, early 40s, right? Many of them began to move to Africa, Australia, new destination, new opportunities, right? This began to happen. So it was essentially those Marwaris, right? Marwari entrepreneurs who had learned the art of new economy, right? Who got exposed to this new skill, right? New institutions and also the global development about everything. They slowly began new entrepreneurs. Obviously, the Assamese speaking population also, a section of them also they became part of it. A section of the Bengali speaking population also became part of it. But by that time, I think at the mass of the profit, it was already taken over, right? So this book is mostly about
Absolutely.
that part of the
The
story.
post-independence.
Post-independent
That
story.
brings us to the grievances and complaints that were very much still there, in fact, started developing post-independence. Because even with the oil refineries, for instance, you have this section describing this long debate about where should a new oil refinery in Assam be set up, and there are several now. But this was sometime in the early 60s, I think, or was it the late 50s? Late 50s with Nehru, this back and forth with Nehru, and you hear this impatience in his approach, where it's like, what does the location of the refinery have to do with the development of the country? It should not become an emotional issue. But it was a very emotional issue, and there was this feeling that it should be in Assam. If oil is being mined or excavated or drilled from Assam, the refinery should be there. And the solution was then to open 2 refineries. Finally, one in Assam, and I think one in
Barauni.
Yeah, Barauni. Yeah.
I think for the audience, I should give a little bit of extra explanation about this phenomenon. You know, by 1820s, 1824, 25, that there is a petroleum reserve in some parts of Assam that was well known to the East India Company officials. But the science was really at a rudimentary stage. They really could not confirm that whether it was that perfect quality which can be used as a fuel and other combustion elements, right? They have to keep on experimenting throughout the 1850s, 1860s. By 1870s, the British government, the colonial government, they were absolutely sure that this is the petrol, right? And this was the only instance in the entire South Asia that petroleum, underground petroleum, is available for extraction. So experiments in terms of its extractions, bringing technocrats from America and other places, all these things began, and one of the earliest, very tiny petroleum refinery was established in 1900, right? That story began. But till that time, it is a British company, right? So suddenly in 1953, a new discovery, right? So there are billion gallons of oil which is waiting to be excavated. And you can understand, because by this time, Middle Eastern countries, they were oil countries, right? And that oil can make a nation very rich. The people can make you rich. I think that ideas were very much there, right? And I think with the same spirit, with same understanding, there was a jubilation amongst larger sections of the population in that regions that here is the oil which we can extract, which we can convert it into petroleum, petrol and diesel and other things. We can have an industry, and our happy days are coming forward, right? But the big question was, where should be the industry, right? Should Assam has a right over the natural resources? And and these were really debates which were shaping at that time. There was no final conclusions about where such kind of interest, who owns the oil, right, or who owns these natural resources, right? These contentious issues were debated, sorted out, right? But we should also note that Nehru was an extreme believer in a very powerful government, right? And he was pushing for, he and his government, right, that it should be definitely for the nation, right? It should not belong to the provinces, right? So it took some time, right? So, and finally decision was made that the industry must be nearer to the port, nearer to a metropole. Calcutta must be the first choice, right? But it obviously produced a serious political disagreement. 50s was a classic example where provincial governments were often at odds with Nehru's government, right? Nehru was trying to push for more power in Delhi, but India's provinces were equally powerful, right? And they really pushed it, and after really years and years of negotiations and some unwillingness to bow down to Nehru's demand, finally it was decided an Indian company, rupee company would be formed, and refinery would be in Assam, one, and another would be in Barauni. But what does it tell? It tells many stories. It tells the making of a republic, right? How the republic was made in the 1950s, about resources, about the powers of provinces, about the powers of New Delhi, about rights over the resources, and also the aspirations of Indians at that time. All those issues were, I think, highly debated in the 50s, and my book tells about those trajectories.
See, another thing, another C, which touches on all these things that you mentioned, the relation between the provinces and the center, regional aspirations, Nehru's interventions, all of these things was also related to another issue that has been especially important to Assam, modern Assam, and that is the idea of citizenship. Who is a citizen? And this again is a theme that runs through your book. Assam has seen waves of immigrants from Bengal mostly, starting early, it's all happening all through the 19th century, and it intensifies in the 20th century. And then, of course, you have this enormous migration called Partition, which sort of triggers an en masse migration of people into the regions of Western Bengal as well as Assam. And it's very fascinating that a lot of debates on who is an Indian citizen actually first took place in Assam even before the official citizenship bill in 1955, which was only enshrined into law in 1955 in the parliament. 5 years before that, already in Assam, you're having these debates about how do we decide who should stay and who should go. It really boils down to that. And there was already a law, I believe, in 1950, right? 1950, the law about expulsion of the illegal immigrant. It's a very starkly named, very starkly named law. And again,
support came from wide range of politicians from across the country.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
They were basically condemning Nehru for becoming too wide-hearted, right?
And you mentioned how when this is being debated, which is obviously such a sensitive issue, Nehru actually stays out of the whole debate, right. That particular debate, and then this is inked as a law, and it's the parliament that is debating this. It's not a state subject. And again, citizenship is something that one could talk about for a very long time. All of these issues came back up again in discussion once the CA and the CAB and then the CA were being discussed. So I don't want to go into the larger politics, but what I want to ask you in relation to Assam is that there has been so much concern with legal instruments to decide about who is a refugee, who's an immigrant, who's illegal, who's Assamese, who's Indian. A lot of push for having laws instated. But the laws never actually deliver what seems to be the aspiration, which is to create a very clear-cut idea of who's in and who's out. And you see this repeated over and over again. When the Assam student agitation starts in the 70s and goes on to the 80s, there are these multiple rounds of talks with Indira Gandhi about how do we decide the cutoff year for who is a genuine resident of Assam and who is not. And just that cutoff year then becomes very contentious, and there's so much debate about that. So to me, it was just a very fascinating gap between debate on the law, this push towards we should have laws, but even the 1950 law, you say very quickly it became defunct. It became like a paper tiger. It was actually used very sparingly, and very few people were actually evicted. So how do you explain that, this sort of obsession with laws, or not obsession, but this faith that the laws will deliver, and in actual fact, You just keep going back to the parliament, going back to the legislature, going back to government saying we need better laws.
Okay. I think it is a really vast subject and it requires probably, what I'll do, because we cannot keep on going on for this, I'll divide my explanations into two short, small parts. I'll begin with the contemporary. Contemporary for me would be 1970s and 80s. Then I'll go back to little earlier time, but two distinct kind set of answers. You know, 1971, when the Bangladesh war broke out, right, the war for Bangladesh independence, right, it's a new story. It's all of a sudden, right? From the March 1971 till October 1971, there was a sudden and huge rush of population from East Pakistan to several parts of India, especially.
I stopped with partition, but that was an even greater exodus.
Which actually sparked of the debate finally. There things were going on at a different time.
But this was the big...
It's a big thing. The primary recipient of this refugees, right? Let us use the word refugees, West Bengal, right? And Assam, the state of Meghalaya, which was just formed, taking shape as a political idea. It would be formally declared in few months. And also to some extent Tripura, right? Assam was receiving almost per hour 1,800 people for this entire duration per hour, right? This was an official position of the Prime Minister's office. Mrs. Indira Gandhi, she would visit those areas. In fact, that refugee movement to India, it sparked of a serious crisis for Mrs. Gandhi to get involved in this debate about East Pakistan. And she pressurized the global community also that we need to get involved with this immediately. Now, after the formal declaration of Bangladesh, and what will happen to them, right? Most of these global observers, Indian diplomats, Indian bureaucrats, they all knew that by this time, by 1972, most of these people, they basically got mingle and be part of their brothers and sisters and their families, right? It was not easy. But the official positions Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and Mrs. Gandhi took in July 1972, that very soon these people will be taken back. That was the positions that both Mrs. Gandhi and Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, they had formally declared in a joint press conference in July 1972. But Prime Minister's office also knew it very clearly. P.N. Haska, who was Mrs. Gandhi's secretary at the time, right, private secretary, that it is not easy, right? Because how do you identify these people, right? And it is a big humanitarian crisis. Because Assam suddenly received, I said that suddenly, after a brief gap of the 47, right? This would now spark of local political debates, and because by this time you have laws and other things, right? So this intensity of directions, right, against migrants, right? It suddenly took a new form, right? It was almost like the sudden crisis in many parts of the world. But, you know, the Bangladesh crisis, the migrations outflow, it was also caused by not only war, but by all kinds of devastations that was caused to that regions, right? Ecological devastations and other kind of devastations that region had experienced over a period of time. I'll come back to that a little later. So between 1980 to 1983, so let's say let me rectify, 1980 and 1982, this was the point of contentions between Mrs. Gandhi and the leaders in Assam about the year on from which date we will send back the people back to Bangladesh, right? Mrs. Gandhi was also sure that we should send them back because it is not easy for West Bengal and many parts of India to accommodate such a large numbers of people. Several millions of people arrived all of a sudden, right, producing social, cultural, and other kind of crisis, both for the refugees as well for the local people also. It was not an easy situation, right? And she was desperately looking for all options to resolve this big crisis. The point of debate was which year. Now, from which year they should be taken back. Mrs. Gandhi insisted that why not 71, right? The people who actually came after 71, right, during the war time, because this was the public promise that she has made with another, her counterpart with Bangladesh at that time. But the Assamese students who were well versed in the legalities of citizenships, they knew and they read very well about the 1955 Citizenship Act, right? They kept on insisting on that point, that we want all of them to be pushed back outside our country. And finally, it produced bitter violence, right? 1983, that February violence, Nelly violence, all these things. In fact, in the preceding months of Nelly, whether we could have avoided this big crisis or not, in fact, we could have avoided that situations.
If she had agreed, would you say?
No, it was a different point altogether. The issue was whether a state government can be in president's rule for a longer period of time, for more than 1 year.
And she enforced the elections?
No, she was not interested. In November 1982, it was almost a kind of all-party consensus. All-party consensus that we will pass an amendment to the law which insists that it is maximum for 6 months and 6 months and 1 year, and we will extend it for another 6 months. However, in December 1982, the oppositions who had withdrawn their support to this promised amendment of this law in the parliament, right? And finally, the government, and obviously government was not interested anymore to negotiate on this issue. Finally, election happened, and the election produced one of the worst massacre in modern history of India, I think, I would say, right? Nelly, right? It was definitely no doubt about that. But I think you also refer to this important question of migrations. You know, this has remained one of the contentious, extremely debatable subject over a period of time. But let me just point out one critical point, right? Why so much of people started arriving in, right? You know, I think the story is also about colonialism, right? It is nothing to do with that these people are coming in search of better livelihood or better other kind of opportunities. It was largely a forced migration which took place since the 1860s, right? One phase, it is for the tea plantations and also for the jute cultivations. You know, from 1860s onward, jute emerged one of the jute industry was one of the major industry in India. One was the cotton industry in the Western India, and the other was the jute in the Eastern India. Jute was in huge demand for the global commodity market. You need to pack it, all the packaging, and for everything, jute was in huge demand. Right. So, who will produce and where you are going to produce? It is this watery landscape of Assam was seen to be one of the important places. By this time, the people in West Bengal, East Bengal, right, their environmental situations, their poverty, it had intensified like anything, primarily as a result of this British colonial rule, right? You know, by 1890s, Bengal had reached a point of saturation where you cannot cultivate. There is no land for cultivations. It's saturate. It has reached a point of saturation. But you were insisting for jute cultivations. They encouraged more people to migrate, moved into the similar directions, and migration occurred, right? And most of the people who migrated, right, they remain poor forever, right? It's not that, yeah, they didn't obviously make any profit out of it, right? In fact, in 1929, when the World Economic Depression set in, it was a horrible situation for them, right? Because by this time, credit, money lending had worsened the situations. It was an unbelievable situation for most of the migrant population, right? So anyway, I think this is how the things were unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the tragedy, that there is so much of political debate about ethnicity, religion, nationality, but ultimately you have a poor citizenry in East Bengal that becomes Bangladesh, you have a poor citizenry in Assam, and like you say at the end of the book, in many ways Assam remains a poor state, and to me that's a story really of a tragedy. But I don't want to close with that because I still have one more C to discuss, and that is culture. That is culture, which I think is very, very important to the story of Assam, because it has had in the modern period, certainly all through the 20th century, very energetic champions of its culture. And that started, as you describe, it started getting, as the 20th century advanced, it started getting more and more interested, that group of people, in trying to discover the sort of the Aryan classicist, Sanskritized roots of Assamese culture. And starting from there, all through the book, in segments, or sort of actually just woven through the story, are these accounts of how the Assamese related to their culture and what they championed, what they defended, what they produced. And to me, that is also equally interesting in relation to the other two things, which is the Cinderella syndrome and this whole debate about citizenship. And you quote a visiting, I think it was a journalist or a diplomat, a British or American, who says, Assam does not cultivate its land, it cultivates its culture. So this idea that culture is so important. And I think it's been one of the things you say, which is very interesting, kind of sums it up, is that Assam has had a move to sort of create an Assamese nationalist culture to show things that are exclusively Assamese and which you can draw on for a sense of Assamese identity. But then there's also been the move to relate that to the broader Indian scenario. And in fact, you say very early in the book that Assam was never cut off. It's always been part through trade, through various kinds of encounters, but I think later in the 20th century, also through this imagination of Assam as part of this broader North Indian culture. So this sort of two-track nationalism in the cultural imagination, and I think that's really interesting. But how did that idea of Assam then sit with the fact that it has people from so many different cultures that are part of it? And I think there was a tension there in the whole of the modern period, right? Because you say the whole political scenario, the whole political system became more and more Assamization, right? Whether it was language, the move to make Assamese the language of the state as early as 1960, whether it's producing these histories that enshrine a longer history for Assam. All of this was going on, but at the same time, politically, Assam said we are all these other segments as well. We are the hills where people may not even speak Assamese. They're from different ethnicities. Even in the plains, there are people who didn't subscribe wholeheartedly to this sort of essentialist idea of Assam. So, would you say there has been a tension between this Assamese essentialist sort of tendency and the fact that I think it's one of the most multicultural provinces, has been certainly in the past one of the most multicultural provinces in India. So how did those two things sit together?
I think this is most difficult for me to answer probably. You know, for an average resident of Assam and who speaks Assamese, probably he or she would use languages from different kind of linguistic registry. There may be one word from Bodo, one word from Mishing, one word probably from Kashi, one word from Garu. I would also say that probably their culinary history would also be shaped from different kind of practices of food, plants, or varieties of complex and or multiplicity of culture, right, that is there. So even the Brahmaputra, which is also my favorite subject, right, though it is a Sanskrit name, it has many other kind of non-Sanskrit name, right? And over a long period of time, Brahmaputra used to have such many kind of baptizations, right, in terms of its names and such kind of things, right? This is the peculiarity of that regions, right? However, especially in the 20th century, though the process began of the discovery of the Assamese in the 19th century through archaeological investigations from RAND, and many of them were essentially British investment, right? Most archaeological investigations in the 19th century, they were happening and they were finding only temples. They were not finding other cultures, right? Other non-classical religious practices, right? But at least in the 20th century, the process of Assamization of this complex religious, linguistics, cultural, culinary, everything was becoming more monolingual, right? Or a kind of monoculture, right? If we can bring that metaphor from the forestry, that was happening. And most of these people who were doing it, they were well trained in the field of Sanskrit, a kind of Indo-Aryan linguistics domain, right? So they were really expert and very good in that. They were very comfortable in speaking to a Tamil scholar, is very comfortable to speaking to a Marathi philologist at the time. And through their works, through their control over the institutions, the process of this monolingualism, the rise of one single strain amongst these many strains of languages, right? The process became more and more crystallized. It became more confidence, right? And the institutions which took shape, especially post-1940s, whether it was academic institutions, cultural institutions, right? Or even economic institutions, right? These institutions were slowly gearing up, right, to accept one. But this finally produced many layers of tensions, mostly in the 1970s and 80s, right? Assam's turned out to be a place of wide range of ethnic conflict, movements. Let us not use the word conflicts, movements, right? Who would assert their own rights, due rights, right? And it also produced many layers of outcomes, right? Contesting the Assamization process. But the Assamization process also produced an idea that Assam is essentially a part of South Asia, right? Assam is part of an pan-Indian story, right? So that story became firmly integrated. But you know, Assam was at the center of many geographies, right? Southeast Asia, the Eastern Himalaya, deep, say, the Bay of Bengal, right? It was at the center of many such kind of cultural, political, ecological, and economic confluences, right? But suddenly, I think its geography got reoriented, its outlook got reoriented, and obviously the nation-making process of the post-1947, it gave legitimacy to these ideas in a different directions, right?
I won't inflict any more C's on you. I will just ask you, I think we should also leave some time for questions. So just ask you maybe a final question, and then we'll see how it goes with the audience discussion. But I I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm always fascinated by historians who marshal a lot of sources. I mean, you have at least 200 pages of footnotes and bibliography. It's really a stupendous task. And what I really admire about the book, apart from the range and the scope of it, is how you describe as fully as possible, but you try and keep your own, I mean, there's judgment, but there isn't opinion, is how I would put it. You keep your opinion out of it, but you do judge the sources, and you try to present the most balanced view, giving for and against opinions on most issues. But I can't imagine it to have been easy at all, given how many points of, I mean, it is also a history of debate, argument, and often conflict, this whole modern history of Assam. So what was the hardest thing about writing this book? What was the most difficult?
Okay. You know, the most difficult task was the processing an image of Assam, right? How do I process this image, right? Not about Assam, about the time, right? Obviously, I have not seen it, right? And I have not seen them. I have not seen that time, right? I have only seen it through my archives, right? It's not an easy job, right? And how do I do justice to millions of people, also non-humans, plants and others? How do I understand? It took me really, these are moral, political, and also cultural questions, right? This is one part. Then, you know, these are billions and billions of dots, right? And how to assemble them and then to convert them into a fine cinematography, right? That was a difficult task, right? You know, in our masters, in our undergraduate days, we all learned very complex historical text, right? But, you know, on an average, what I found that an average Indian reader would find those our textbooks, right, difficult to comprehend, right? Now, it was also my responsibility to play with the art of the prose, right? It is not an easy thing, right? Most of our poorly trained in the literary language, right? So these two issues, how do I visualize that situations? Then how to convert these billions of archival dots into a cinematographic prose? I think these are two major challenges, what to say and what not to say, right? Because it is not easy, right? And I know that there would be thousands of people who disagree and some people who would agree, right? So I have to also engage with that kind of issues. These are largely conceptual issues, political issues, right? And as you rightly say it, right, historians cannot have opinion, right? They must have judgments, right? But I cannot inflict punishment on my past, right? I can to some extent, on some instances, in some events, I must have that punishment, right? You really did not do well, and you really did not do politically, morally. That was a crime of that time, right? But in most of the issues, I think, to maintain this balance between a judge and a historian, right? I think this was a difficult thing. I think, and I'm sure most of the people here will also agree with me on this moral dilemma of being a historian, right? And I know that my facts have to be correct. My conclusions needs to be largely agreed upon, but they have to disagree on valid points, right? If they are disagreeing, it cannot be on merely on the feelings, right? It must be based on certain very strong empirical facts.
So much, Arup. If we have any questions, we'll take them, and then...
Hi. My question is about, I read in your book about the Kamrupa Onukhandan Homiti, and I was, if you could tell more about their role in establishing the antiquity of Assamese scripts, manuscript, puthi, and the language and literature. That's a topic that interested me a lot.
You know, this is quite interesting. You know, the second decade of the 20th century is an amazing decade. You know, this was the decade also the discovery of Indus Valley civilization, right? We have just celebrated 100 years of discovery of Indus Valley civilization. You know, the first decade of the 20th century, there was a major impetus for archaeological discoveries, especially by the Archaeological Survey of India, which was largely an imperial organization, but to explore the deep root of the ancientness of India, right? And many Indians, right, who are now well-trained in the modern philology, archaeology, and many other branches of knowledge, right? They knew very well that this long legacy of Indian subcontinent needs to be understood, explored very carefully. And the results were very clear. In many parts of, especially in the eastern India, for example, Pataliputra, Patna, all those regions were also basically excavated around the same time, right? Kamrup Onukhandan Committee, which was a small, tiny group, right? You know, the building was smaller than this room. The people, they assembled there, they knew about this global trends, what is happening across the different parts of the world, especially the ancient story, right? And it is not only about glories of ancient time, it is also about thinking about a long legacy of the political past of Indian subcontinent. They began to investigate, especially sculptures, inscriptions. And these were not easy things, right? Collecting an inscriptions, dating it, then writing a very faithful account of those things. Those process they began, right? In fact, in one gentleman called Hamchandra Goswami, right, who was trained in English literature, trained in Sanskrit, trained in Bengali, right, who was actually discouraged by his parents not to study English, that you cannot study because English is basically an outcast language. You cannot study. But anyway, he learned it. What he did, he found such kind of inscriptions dating back to 11th and the 12th century, and he didn't discuss anything about that. He wrote a poem on that, Priyotamar City, a letter to my loved one, right? Precisely describing these inscriptions, right? And what they began to do, they began to collect these manuscripts, architectural heritage. They didn't use the word heritage, right? All kind of artifacts, they began to assemble them and they began to present it and see. Many of them, what they began to do, they actually began to challenge the epistemological, right? Or say the intellectual trajectory of the colonial government, right? You know, you have written about us like this. Let us see what we can also write. So this kind of, you know, the cultural, political, intellectuals, debates also began to grow. Kamrup Onukhandan Committee actually succeeded in a very short period of time, producing a new kind of energy, right? You know, many of them, they were constantly in search of artifacts, right? They will go to a hill, find out if there is any inscriptions, if there is any artifacts, right? All such, and also expanding the political image of ancient Assam, right? Whether it is in Sylhet, whether it is in other parts of India, right? So they will connect this Assam and the larger South Asia in different way. So Kamrup Onukhandan Committee, it began to play this role from 1912. 1940, it made the first major decisive statement, right? We want to display all our wealth. Finally, the Assam State Museum will come up, right? And see, this is the museum that we have assembled all this. This also led to what I said, Assamizations, right? They essentially relegated many other cultural developments that were happening, right? Say the Boru-speaking communities and other linguistics, cultural and other heritage, they would not become the central story. The Assam story would become the main story. Unfortunately, we have not written too much on Kamrup Anukhandhan Committee. One of my PhD students has just submitted her thesis essentially on this aspect, how ancient Kamrupa was discovered in the colonial time, and Kamrup Anukhandhan Committee played an important role in that. But thank you for asking that, right?
Yeah. My name is Bala. I work for a media company. So I just finished a day back. I finished a trip from Assam. So I just saw the city was full of dust. And I spoke to a lot of people. Some people were telling stories about how a private chain of hotels were trying to construct their branch in a place where it was not supposed to be constructed. And there were also people who wanted a four-way lane inside Kaziranga. So I also observed some half-built houses, and it was full, like it was spread across the city. So how do you think Assam should grow sustainably? Like, I just felt the city is aspiring to become another metropolitan city. So, is there a pushback from the locals to Assam? Guwahati, yeah. So, is there a pushback from the locals to have this growth sustainably, or are the people divided?
Your question has two parts. I'm not the competent person to answer the second part, right? I'm neither a town planner, I'm not an economist, right? So my answers would be a layman answer, so I should not answer that. But the Das part I should answer. I have a book on Brahmaputra also, and I have spent months and months and years thinking about this tiny particle called the dust. You know, my favorite phrase I keep saying about that, Assam is essentially, like Bangladesh, a flattened Himalaya. If you flatten the Himalaya, it is Assam, right? You know, Assam is essentially composed of this tiny, which is 0.06 millimeter in size, right? In diameter size, right? This small particle called sand, right? Which is making the foundation of Assam, right? Same for Bengal, large parts of Bengal, same for Bangladesh, right? All these sands, right, these are basically rock sediments which comes from because of chemical and other outcomes, processes, geomorphological process of the Himalayas. They are carried by the tributaries and Brahmaputra, right? They come and they settle into, and for millions and millions of years, right, these sands have really created the foundation of the modern geography of Assam, and let's say the Ganga-Brahmaputra basin, right, in that area. This sand have stabilized over a period of time because of its chemical properties, because of its physical properties, and there is always a tendency for them to fly, right? Either to move, they move to Bay of Bengal with the water. Many a times they fly into the sky. The village that I come from, it is called Bali Bhui. Bali means sand, Bhui means when the sand comes out of during the earthquake, it is part of that, right? So if I dig into my soil in my backyard, probably 4 or 5 feet, I'll get the water, right? Sand and then the water. So this, for a long period of time, because of continuous rainfall, we have a really long history of stable rainfall. At least, say, 1400 to the 1800, we have a stable rainfall pattern. Climate was absolutely stable. And this also helped in the stability of the pre-colonial political systems at the time. Now, because of the expansion of agriculture, expansion of, in the 20th century, population has continued to increase over a period of time. And this is also because of the disappearance of the epidemics. Between 1880s to 1920s, Assam was rocked by 4 epidemics: black fever, the smallpox, cholera. These were the 4, and malaria, right? All combined together, on and off, they would kill 25% of the total populations, right? Several millions of people died, right? Very little work has been done on those aspects. But since 1920s, there is a secular growth of population, demography. And this has helped in the expansion of population and also agriculture. This means, more or less, right, the grasslands have begun to disappear, right? And it is being slowly replaced by the hardwood, right? Hardwood really cannot provide covers to the dust, right? And then you see only the dust in the sky. For the last 10 years, I have been waiting to get a clear weather, a clear sky, to get a better picture of the Brahmaputra. I have not got a better picture of Brahmaputra because I don't get any clear picture. It is full of dust. And it's a complex geomorphological, geochemical, human, all contributed to the flow of dust into the sky. It is an envelope of deep coverage of dust layer that you can see, right? How we mitigate all these things? I'm sure there are other competent people in the field who can answer these things, right? But I can only explain what happened over a period of time.
Arup, congratulations for this big book. A lazy mind would not have produced this.
Right.
So, this book, it just doesn't have readers. It also has listeners. I must tell you, 2 of my students have come all the way from Tumkur, 100 kilometers, to listen to you, because probably they want to write one more book like this on Karnataka history. So, congratulations for that. But already I have 2 questions. One, you have partly answered that question, the writing process. I just would like to know, what was the process of writing, again from conceiving the theme of the book and refining it until the publication. I want to know, how did you grapple with the archive, chapterization? How did you struggle to write each chapter? And related to this, why didn't you think of writing the same book in Assamese? And last question is about the philosophy of history. You are a historian, and I must tell you, I have read some parts of the book, not the entire book, and it's extremely engaging prose, good narrative also. What is your conception of history in this age of AI, artificial intelligence? What is the task of the historian? Or as a historian, what is your belief in the writing of history? Why should one write history? I think too many questions.
3 questions with 7 sub-questions.
I don't think I'm competent to answer all these questions.
Why don't
But
you answer the one about I'm also curious to learn about you've also obviously drawn on a huge range of Assamese sources, but you chose to write it in English. So I'm also curious to know why.
I love writing in Assamese. It doesn't mean that I don't like. In fact, this book is now getting translated into Assamese, right? Not by me, because I'm writing a book in Assamese, a different book on 19th century in Assamese. One of the reasons why I didn't write in Assamese is probably the technological challenges, right? Writing in English, technologically is much more comfortable. I think this is your computer, your laptops, editing, those MS Words are much more well equipped to handle the Western languages compared to probably Indian languages. I may be corrected on that matter. So that was my challenge. I like writing by hand, right? I do like seeing the black ink, blue ink, right? But I also like the beauty of the vernacular process, right? The vernacular prose, right? When I can keep on experimenting in grammar, in terms of verse, in terms of this structure in my own way, right? I'm in complete control, right? I don't need to be fully determined, regulated by the dictionary and the Western lexicography, right? This is where I have comfort with, and my wife, who teaches in an university, she keeps telling me why your fascinations for the archaic prose, right? Why you're you're passionate to it, the too many archaic and often also very strong the colloquial vocabularies, right? Why you like to? I said this is how I can engage with my readers, right? My readers cannot be only who are university professors. I want my readers to be also a general average reader, right? Who can listen to me, with whom I can argue. For me, on an average, and plus 10 student, plus 12 student is my favorite reader who can think, who can push these arguments in a brilliant way, and and also there's others, right? I'm not excluding the others. So this helped me in thinking about my prose, especially my engagement in the Assamese literature. And I strongly believe that Indians must write in their own languages, right? And we should celebrate that. But the issue is also the publication houses. Right? You know, some of the global publishing houses, they really don't pay attention to the Indian languages. They do give some, especially some of the powerful languages, like say Hindi or probably Bengali, whom I am familiar with. Other languages, I don't know anything about it, so I should not comment. This is where the powerful printing presses have their interests. But who will publish? Will Penguin publish on an Assamese book, right? These are also issues. How do I write? I think everyone has their own methods, own ways. I'm sure a poet has their own way. Novelists would have their own way of writing, and historian would also differ, right? Every historian would write different way. A PhD student who is just on the verge of submitting and getting a job would think of a book in a different way. Probably at my age now, I need to think I have the leisure and opportunity to wait and keep experimenting with my language, with my structures for years, right? Probably a new entrant into the field would have to hurry because they need to get a job and other things. Probably I'm luckier in that case. But your other big questions, maybe we should have it over dinner or other ways, right?
How are we doing with time? Do we have time? 2 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Less than 2 minutes.
So, I'm Aditya, and my question is, I have two questions actually. The first question is, how did this 1971's migration alter the ethnic and religious composition of Assam? And secondly, are most of the Muslims in Assam Bengali or Assamese?
1971 migration, it did not fundamentally alter anything, right? Because it was brief, the volume was less compared to what happened in the earlier decades, right? You know, the largest migration took place, largest in several millions between 1898 to 1930. 1930 was the epic of the global depression, economic depression, and the jute prices collapsed, right? And nobody was interested, right? Why I should go and cultivate jute, right? So that was the last time when the big migration took place. Rest of the migrations were temporary, right? And it did not have any fundamental contribution in the change of, say, demography, religious, cultural aspects, right? The only thing that happened in the post-1974, right? You know, 1974, there was a major famine in New Bangladesh, right? And the government really could not control in that country, right? Sheikh Mujibur Rahman was really helpless in controlling that famine. That famine also led to death. This was the time when new set of people started arriving in, but this time what happened, these migrants, they thought it will be difficult given the political climate, citizenship debates that were happening in 72, 73, right? So most of these people now decided quickly to take voting right? They will go and explore methods that largely are negotiated with different layers of bureaucracy to make their name available in the electoral roll. This immediately sparked of debate in 75, 76, especially the people who were basically the local police officials and others who knew that these things were happening. But the answer to your first question was that the 71 migration, it was tiny compared to others. It was still big. It did not contribute fundamentally to anything. Then what was your next question? Most were Bengalis. Right. You know, there are Assamese Muslims who were essentially who accompanied the Mughal, the military, right, in the 16th and the 17th century. And you know, Mughal military system is a very complex system. It is not the people who were raised essentially in Delhi. On the way, they will raise their army, right? Many of them stayed back. And over a period of time, they were accommodated in the political bureaucratic structure of the local kingdom, right? They would adopt local religious, say, cultural and other kind of practices who would, over a period of time, they also help in producing powerful syncretic cultures, right? And they would be called Assamese Muslims, but those who essentially moved in this time period, 1898 to 1930, they would be termed as largely Bengali, because they spoke Bengali at that time. But many of them, right, over a period of time, they learn, because Assamese is also lingua franca, right? They would speak in public domain Assamese, back at home, they would speak Bengali. So they were really brilliant, intelligent enough to learn many, many languages, right? They would obviously speak to a Marwari in their vernacular, to a Nepali in their vernacular, right? So acquiring the multiple languages also became the art of being a citizen, right?
I'd like to thank Arupjyoti Saikia and Anjum Hasan for bringing today's session to BIC. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have with us, so thank you to the audience for spending an evening with us. Copies of the Quest for Modern Assam are available outside for purchase and author signing. If you'd like to know more about future BIC events, there's a QR code to our WhatsApp community that you can scan outside. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.